movie rights?
I have not, but for you writers in the room, I will tell you that maybe the best move that I made was to retain all the rights to television and movies in my contract with University of Iowa Press.
Yeah.
So I have been told that I need to get an agent to handle that part of it for me. And so yes, I think you know, I'm framing it as Norma Ray with a twist, because the woman that I told you about, Sherry Buffkin, she fired the union workers. She hated the union, and yet she became the lead witness for the government against Smithfield Foods that laid the foundation for the union win. So Norma Ray with a twist. Her husband, who still works at Smithfield Foods, is still not a member of the union.
Would it be Norma Ray with a squeal?
Oh!
I mean, technically there's a twist on the end of the page.
That would be.
Yes.
So Lynn, this was a long time coming, this book.
Yes.
But how do you feel about the timing, now that it is here at this moment and this point in history? Reflections?
Well, I think that's why I really wanted to emphasize tonight the new Gilded Age. And I know it got a bit theoretical and, you know, trying to look at this big context, but I think that's really important because the 1% is screwing themselves. You know, you know, Chili's is going, J.C. Penney, you know, I mean, they're all going out of business, right? Because people can only afford high end or low end. So, I mean, the middle class is being hollowed out. I didn't get into a lot of the numbers there because I know it can be overwhelming. But the middle class is diminishing, and that does track right along with the unions. So I don't know how to answer that exactly, except that's very disturbing, and it feels like that it's hitting ground at a really important time in our society when we simply have to think about our values and what is most important. And this idea, I remember sitting at Smithfield headquarters with Larry Pope, who was, I think he was CFO at that point, and he said, we're talking about pennies, less than pennies on the pound. I mean, the competition is, we have to cut costs. We can't compete. Walmart is choosing their suppliers on the basis of pennies, you know. And so where do we as consumers fit into that? How much are we willing to give away for the cost of meat, right? And I mean, the cost of meat it's far beyond just the cost to the workers. It's, you know, the cost to the environment, the cost to the animals. I mean, it's all just a bad system. It's a bad system of feeding ourselves. But are we not willing to pay a couple pennies more so that workers, so the line speeds can slow down a little bit, right? Are we just valuing the bottom line and not the physical well-being of the people who do the work that puts the food on the table? So, yes, sir.
First off, as somebody who grew up in Smithfield and swam in that dirty river before they realized
I heard it was really gross.
I want to thank you for writing the story. And you mentioned something earlier while you were speaking. You said this story is now mine to tell. And I'm wondering, you know, as someone who's, you know, honestly not familiar with a lot of your past work, and kind of ask you to talk about how this story came to be yours, and like what you were working on before, and like how long the whole process has been and so forth.
Yes, so it's been a long process. So I was first assigned, now other people have done portions of this story. The New York Times sent somebody in undercover into that plant. If you haven't read it, Charlie LaDuff in the New York Times, Google it. It's an incredible piece of work.
We'll put it on the website.
Yes, yes. The Fayetteville paper has covered this, you know, as a daily newspaper, right? But no one had put the whole story together. So in 2005, Virginia Business sent me to do a profile of Smithfield Foods. And I came back and I said, you know, this company is kind of corrupt, you know? And they were like, yeah, write that story. So I did, and they didn't like that very much. So they changed it a lot, and I put my dug my heels in, and I did get what I wanted in that story, but then they never sent me on any other story. But, so that was the first time, and then I wrote, Tom Robotham and I talked about a 3-part series on Smithfield that was going to be labor, environment, and then they were basically exporting the whole business model into Poland, which they successfully did. So it was going to be a 3-part series, but it wasn't possible financially for me to execute that. But I did get the first story done for him, and that was more to my, what I wanted to write, the way I wanted to write about it.
In portfolio.
In Portfolio Weekly, yes. And then it just kind of idled. I mean, it was working its way through the courts. There was nothing really happening. Smithfield was appealing. The union was waiting, and they were organizing, but nothing was really happening. So I went back to get my MFA to become a professor. I went back in 2008, and then I revisited this. And that's when I finally tracked down Sherry Bufkin. And I was very excited about this story, this imperfect, talk about, an imperfect vessel, someone who really hated the union and became instrumental in helping the government win its case against Smithfield. So I tracked her down, so that's the story that I sold to University of Iowa Press, was one woman's story of taking on a poor white girl from Bladen County, North Carolina, who took on the largest meat processor and meat packer in the country, in the world, and won.
And this was in 2008?
Yes. No, this was in that case was won
No,
in...
I'm sorry,
yes.
When you sold the...
Oh, yes. I sold it. I started working on it with my thesis, and I sold it in about, let me think here.
So you've been working on this book
2003
for about 10 years. Basically.
Well, yeah. but only intensively for the past 3 years. That's what I'm trying to wrap my mind around. I have no idea. It's been a really long time. So then when the editors got it, the first draft, then, and this is what's so great about working with a good editor, is she said, this is much more than Sherry's story. And there was a problem with the narrative arc. Sherry as a character, why she turned on Smithfield Foods was a very slippery, I mean, if that's the height of the narrative arc, if that's the climax, I mean, it was extremely difficult to pin her down. Why did she decide to testify against Smithfield Foods? So that was problematic narratively. But more importantly, the editor said, this is a much bigger story. You're not seeing the big picture, you're not seeing the big story. So I went back and then found that, and so then the UFCW and Smithfield both are still under a federal gag order. So imagine reporting this story and nobody will talk to you, right? So nobody from the UFCW has officially ever commented for this book. And yet they're the hero, whatever. But I tracked down the head of the campaign, the mastermind of this amazing union campaign. His name is Gene Bruskin. And I emailed him and I said, hey, Gene, I'm working on this book, and somebody said I should talk to you. And he, within 15 minutes, I got a phone call. He said, who are you? What are you doing? Right? What's going on here? And I told him, he said, I'll talk to you. He said, I'm retired. What are they going to do? Send helicopters and hover over my house and swoop down and arrest me? He said, this story needs to be told. He said, gag order be damned. So he's very much a part of this book, and he tells the whole inside story of how they went up against Paula Deen, they boycotted Smithfield Foods, they protested outside Harris Teeter, as some people were talking, remembered that, in North Carolina. They got the entire city of New York City to boycott the purchase of Smithfield Foods. I mean, it was pretty amazing stuff. So anyway, that was kind of the working with the editor and learning that it was a much bigger story, and then really digging in. Then the problem became, for you writers, the narrative arc. So it sort of has two narrative arcs, right? But it is what it is, and that's how it became my story to tell. Because I had just continued working on it, digging, turning the next rock over. And just like in journalism, you get the sources and then they trust you, right? They're not talking to other people. So and there wasn't anybody else doing this book. There was one woman who was doing a book on a series of union encounters, And so she and Jean had talked about that, and so she had done that. But
she wrote about the Newport News stuff in the 70s, I think. She just published about 6 months ago.
I think so, yeah. So.